The cluster approach came out of the humanitarian reform process. This was an interagency activity that was very much in response to the recognition that the humanitarian activities could be better. The needs of disaster-affected populations could be better met through coordinated action. A number of recommendations came out of that review, one of which was the need for more preparedness, greater predictability. Part of that was the identification of a number of agencies in particular sectors, or clusters as they became to be called, to actually take the lead. So there was one particular agency, a go-to agency, who was responsible at a global level for that sector or cluster, but also at a country level during a response. The International Federation has taken on the responsibility as being the convener of the emergency shelter cluster in natural disasters. We co-chair this cluster with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, who have a responsibility for convening the cluster in conflict situations.
Often in emergencies, there are many partners who come in with their own resources, their own approaches, own strategies. The cluster then makes sure that it all comes together and we have one consolidated response to that.
The cluster approach fundamentally is being prepared to respond to the emergency shelter needs in a coordinated and effective fashion. And as such, it brings all the actors that take part in shelter provision together. It's not just a federation activity, but it's primarily to bring all the actors together in a coordinated fashion in support of the governments, who are the primary actors, of course, in leading this response to the disasters.
The role of the cluster is to identify and address gaps after a natural disaster. It means a number of agencies rush in to respond to the disaster, and the cluster is a means of bringing those all together, ensuring that there is a common or a coordinated approach to how you address shelter needs, that one agency isn't doing one thing and another agency doing something totally different. So it provides a coordinated response that meets the needs of hopefully most of the people.
In the event of a rapid onset new emergency, at country level, the humanitarian country team should meet. Of course, that includes the International Federation. That team will sit and address the scale of needs, the extent to which it's an international emergency, and the extent to which the government requires support from the international community. If that is the case, the humanitarian country team will look at identifying the particular clusters that are appropriate to that response and the agencies to lead those clusters. So in the case of a larger emergency that requires a big shelter response, it's a natural disaster, that request will come to the Federation. Following that request, the formal process is a message goes to the Emergency Relief Coordinator in New York. The Emergency Relief Coordinator then confers with the global cluster leads that they are aware of and support that recommendation. On the basis of that recommendation, where the International Federation has been requested and has agreed to convene the shelter cluster, the next stage is that the International Federation deploys a shelter coordination team to undertake that coordination role. The shelter coordination team, when deployed by the International Federation, consists of a number of clearly defined roles. These are dedicated positions. They consist of a coordinator, an information manager, a technical advisor. Depending on the scale of the response, that also may require a mapping advisor. We are also, in recognition of recovery needs, shelter recovery needs, we tend to look for a shelter recovery advisor. And of course, increasingly, environmental impact is a major concern.
It's really trying to bring together a team with the information management and the technical aspects, and to really gather as much information as we can, disseminate that back out to the group so that all understand what's happening. Crucially, as you do get more and more information, it does give you the ability to map a lot of the areas people are working in and give some direction to those agencies in as to where they should go, so that we're not duplicating assistance to the affected population.
As information manager for the cluster, my responsibility is to gather or collect information from different sources, to put it all together, assemble it into some sort of logical, meaningful way, then to provide some sort of analysis to that information so that information then has real meaning to the users of that information, and then to share it, to disseminate it to the membership and outside of our cluster as well.
The technical advisor comes in because the cluster has a lot of different things to do. There are also plenty of technical issues associated with shelter, so we can count the number of shelter kits distributed, for example, but the technical advisor can come in and look at the actual contents of those kits and how appropriate they are in different circumstances. There's also a role, an advocacy role for the technical advisor, whereby the different humanitarian standards that have been developed for emergency responses can be tabled to cluster members in different countries in different situations and used as a way to guide the shelter response of different agencies and NGOs.
In May of 2005, we adopted the institutionalization of the cluster approach in the Philippines. But of course, we did not have an experience here. And so in the typhoons of 2006, where we were visited by 4 major typhoons, including Typhoon Durian, we thought that this is a good opportunity for us to test it. I think it was easy for us to realize that the challenge during emergencies or during disasters like 4 successive typhoons or a major landslide is to find out who is doing what and whether the gaps in the delivery of humanitarian services is being addressed too in an effective manner.
El rol de ONU Habitat en el grupo sectorial es el de actuar como focal point en la coordinación de lo que es la recuperación temprana después de la emergencia para la rehabilitación y para el desarrollo.
Récemment, l'Union européenne a affirmé sa vision de l'aide humanitaire dans un document commun. Ce document commun, le consensus, affirme très clairement le soutien des États membres et de la Commission européenne à la réforme humanitaire et plus particulièrement à l'approche sectorielle.
Oxfam has an organizational mandate to support humanitarian reform operations and initiatives such as the emergency shelter. So on one hand, we are obliged and take very seriously our responsibility to participate in these structures such as the emergency shelter cluster. But on the other hand, we've been able to see the value in a number of different responses in that the coordination mechanism has been proven effective in supporting especially in terms of a government reconstruction policy. Pakistan, after the earthquake in 2005, is a good example of how the emergency shelter cluster and Oxfam's involvement in that helped change some of the government policies that were making it much more friendly towards people's needs.
If you're faced in the early days, 8 o'clock at night, with a room with 300 people in it, which is not unusual in a large-scale sudden onset disaster, you can't distill a strategy. You can't get best practice from so many people, so you have to set up a system. And the system that has been tried by the Federation, and I have applied it a few times, we call it SAG and TWIG, but those are nasty acronyms. The Strategic Advisory or Action Group, the SAG, and the TWIG, Technical Working Group, is a way of identifying key representatives within each stakeholder group so that you can formulate a strategy and make decisions with no more than 15 people round a table.
I think one of the biggest challenges in the position is often cooperation with the national government. We are there to try and support them and fulfil a gap. However, different communication issues and cultural issues often make that a serious challenge. But it's a welcome one also. We really do have to try and work closely with the government. And it's also the inclusion of the local NGOs to really try and get them on board and find partners for them between international organisations and the local organisations. That's often a big challenge. And keeping people interested, keeping agencies interested, making sure we continue to add value to the agency's operations is important.
The most important is it increases legitimacy of the whole approach. The more members you have in the cluster, the more legitimate your argument when you're trying to make a point to government or to donors. So legitimacy is important. The second is that you have a harmonization of standards. You bring in standards from many, many agencies and you use the best and the most appropriate, and you do that collectively.
La Federación lidera ese grupo sectorial, primero, porque la vivienda es importante para las personas y para las familias. El refugio es el principal o uno de los principales síntomas de recuperación después de un desastre. Protege la dignidad humana, normaliza la vida, protege la salud y hace a las personas más personas.